Nobody is ready for the financial shock that is about to hit America. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: the warning signs have been present for years, but they have been ignored, dismissed, or misunderstood. Crises do not erupt from nowhere. They evolve quietly, accumulating pressure until the moment that pressure becomes impossible to contain. What America is facing now is not a sudden event, but the final stage of a long brewing cycle, one that carries the unmistakable imprint of every major financial unraveling in history. On the surface, everything appears stable. The markets fluctuate but remain alive. People continue to work, shop, and spend as if nothing fundamental has changed. Headlines claim that inflation is cooling, that job growth is steady, that the economy is resilient. But beneath that thin layer of reassurance lies a set of structural fractures that have deepened year after year. These fractures do not make noise. They do not demand attention. But they are there, widening quietly in ways that most citizens, and even many leaders, do not fully grasp. Consider the first and most obvious fracture: the erosion of purchasing power. Prices rise, but wages do not. The official numbers suggest improvement, yet the lived experience of millions contradicts that narrative. Groceries cost more. Rent consumes larger portions of income. Medical bills expand faster than savings can keep up. Even the stability of the dollar itself, once considered unquestionable, has begun to slip under the pressure of inflation that refuses to return to pre-pandemic norms. This is not a temporary inconvenience. It is a signal that the foundation of the nation's financial system is shifting. The second fracture is debt, a force that has quietly grown into an existential threat. The United States has accumulated the largest debt burden in its history, and more importantly, the interest on that debt is rising at a pace that outstrips entire federal programs. Debt is not merely a number. It is a future claim on the nation's income. And when that claim becomes too large, the choices available to a country shrink dramatically. It must raise taxes, cut spending, or print more money. Each option carries its own consequences, but history shows that printing money becomes the default path. It is the easiest politically, yet the most destructive economically, because it accelerates the erosion of the currency and fuels the very inflation that is already destabilizing households. The third fracture is confidence. It is the most intangible, yet the most powerful. A financial system is not built on dollars, bonds, or assets. It is built on belief. The belief that the currency retains value, that debts will be repaid, that institutions will function as promised. When that belief weakens, the system begins to wobble. When it breaks, the system collapses. And today, confidence in America's long-standing financial dominance is weakening not only at home, but around the world. The indicators are subtle but unmistakable. Nations reducing their reliance on the dollar, shifting reserves into gold, forming new alliances designed to bypass the American financial architecture. These are not random occurrences. They are coordinated long-term strategies, and they reflect a global understanding that America is entering the late stage of its economic cycle. And yet, despite all these signs, the average American sees only fragments. Rising prices here, higher mortgage rates there, a sense that life is becoming more difficult, but without a clear understanding of why. This is how crises incubate, in the spaces where the truth is visible, but the narrative remains comforting. People assume stability will continue because it always has. But every empire, every dominant power, every financial system has believed the same thing. And every one of them was wrong. The quiet before a shock is always seductive. It feels normal. It feels manageable. It feels safe. But it is in that quiet that the most critical changes take place. America is standing at the edge of a transition it does not yet recognize. A transition driven not by politics, not by ideology, but by arithmetic, history, and the immovable laws of economic cycles. What comes next will redefine what Americans believe about their money, their system, and their future. The surface is calm. The fractures are deep. The pressure is rising. And soon, the illusion of stability will break. Nobody is ready for the moment when it does. The American financial system is entering a stage that few citizens fully understand, but that every major empire in history has eventually faced. It is the point where the underlying mechanisms begin to strain under their own weight, where the solutions of the past no longer work, and where each attempt to stabilize the system creates new, more dangerous imbalances. The cracks are now visible for anyone willing to look beyond comforting headlines and political narratives. They reveal a truth that is far more serious than a temporary economic slowdown. The system is not simply stressed. It is weakening. The most immediate and widely felt indicator of this weakening is inflation. Although officials continue to insist that inflation is under control, the lived reality tells a different story. Prices for essential goods have locked into a higher range, and they are not returning to previous levels. Housing costs have risen to the point that millions can no longer afford to buy homes in their own communities. Food prices continue to outpace wages. Gas, healthcare, insurance, and education all pull income further away from ordinary families. This is not the temporary spike that many predicted. It is structural inflation, sustained by deep systemic pressures that no short-term intervention can resolve. But inflation is only the outer layer of the problem. Beneath it lies a far more serious issue: the exponential growth of debt. The United States has entered a phase where its national debt grows faster than its economy, faster than its revenue, and faster than its capacity to manage the interest. When the interest on debt consumes more of the federal budget than national defense or healthcare, a nation has crossed into the late stage of the debt cycle. Historically, no empire has maintained dominance under such conditions. Sooner or later, the math becomes impossible to escape. Debt is not simply a financial number. It is a reflection of choices deferred, obligations accumulated, and promises made without regard for the long-term consequences. As the government continues to borrow to sustain spending, the burden shifts onto future taxpayers who will face higher taxes, lower benefits, and reduced economic opportunity. Yet even these measures may not be enough. When a nation's debt becomes too large to realistically pay down, the traditional response is to expand the money supply, effectively diluting the value of the currency. This is the silent accelerant of inflation. It is the invisible tax that erodes savings, reduces purchasing power, and destabilizes the foundation of the middle class. However, the most fragile component of the entire system is not inflation or debt. It is confidence. Confidence is the invisible pillar upon which every financial system depends. People accept dollars in exchange for their labor because they believe those dollars will retain value. Investors buy government bonds because they trust the government will repay them. Nations use the dollar for global trade because they believe in its stability. But when confidence weakens, the system begins to unravel in ways that cannot be reversed with policy statements or interest rate adjustments. Confidence erodes slowly at first. a few nations reduce their reliance on the dollar. Banks become more cautious with lending. Consumers delay major purchases. Investors begin to question long-standing assumptions. Then the erosion accelerates. When enough participants begin to act on doubt, the system enters a self-reinforcing cycle of decline. The value of the currency decreases. Inflation rises. Borrowing costs increase. And the pressure on households intensifies. Today, the United States stands at the threshold of this confidence crisis. Indicators that once signaled strength now flash warnings. Savings rates have fallen to historic lows. Corporate bankruptcies are rising. Banks face mounting unrealized losses. Commercial real estate, a sector that underpins much of the financial system, is cracking under the weight of higher interest rates and collapsing demand. Meanwhile, the government continues to borrow at a pace that guarantees even more future strain. Every major empire in history has arrived at this phase. The symptoms change with time, but the pattern does not. An economy becomes dependent on debt. Productivity stagnates. Inflation undermines stability. Confidence weakens. And once the belief in the system begins to fail, no amount of political reassurance can restore what has been lost. America is entering a period where the financial pressures that once felt distant will become personal. This is not speculation. This is not alarmism. It is the natural consequence of mathematical imbalance and historical repetition. The system is cracking, and what breaks next will shape the future of the nation. For nearly 8 decades, the United States dollar has held a position that no other currency in modern history has ever achieved. It became the backbone of global finance, the standard for international trade, and the foundation upon which nations stored their reserves. This dominance was not accidental. It was built on a combination of military power, economic strength, political stability, and global trust. But the world that created the dollar supremacy is changing, and the mechanisms that once cemented America's advantage are slowly being dismantled across the globe. Nations are reassessing their dependence on the United States. They are questioning whether a single country should control the currency that underpins the global economy, and whether the risks of such dependence outweigh the benefits. This shift did not happen suddenly. It began quietly, with small policy changes, regional alliances, and financial experiments that seemed insignificant. But today, these experiments have scaled into a coordinated, global movement toward de-dollarization. The clearest example is the rise of BRICS. What began as a loose economic grouping has transformed into a strategic alliance with ambitions that directly challenge the dollar's dominance. Member nations have discussed alternative currencies, established payment systems that bypass the dollar, and increased trade within their own blocs. Several major energy producers have already conducted transactions outside the dollar system, a move that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. For the United States, this is more than a symbolic gesture. Energy markets have long been the anchor of global dollar demand. If oil transactions continue to shift away from the dollar, the ripple effects will reach every corner of the American economy. Meanwhile, central banks across the world are quietly increasing their gold reserves. Gold does not rely on any government, cannot be printed, and carries no counterparty risk. When nations accumulate gold, it signals doubt in the stability of the existing monetary system. In recent years, this accumulation has accelerated at the fastest pace in half a century. At the same time, Some of the largest economies have reduced their holdings of United States Treasury bonds, a clear indication that they are preparing for a different financial reality. The global shift is not only economic, it is psychological. For decades, the United States enjoyed a unique privilege, the ability to borrow cheaply because the world trusted its currency and institutions. This privilege allowed the nation to expand its influence, fund its military, and sustain levels of spending that would cripple any other country. But as confidence fades, this privilege begins to erode. Borrowing becomes more expensive. Foreign investment weakens. The dollar loses purchasing power, and the geopolitical leverage that once defined American power starts to weaken. The shift is also technological. New digital payment systems, blockchain networks, and regional settlement platforms are reducing the need for a central global currency. Nations that once relied on the dollar for convenience now have alternatives. These technologies are not merely innovations. They are tools of geopolitical transformation. They redistribute power by allowing countries to transact on their own terms without passing through the American financial system. The most striking aspect of this global transition is how quietly it has taken place. Most Americans are unaware that the dollar's share of global reserves has been declining for years. They do not see the diplomatic negotiations where new trade agreements are finalized without the dollar. They do not notice the decline in United States influence in regions once firmly under its sphere. The changes are subtle, incremental, and strategically calculated. But in aggregate, they represent the most significant challenge to the dollar's dominance since the end of the Second World War. The implications for the United States are profound. A weaker global role for the dollar means higher inflation at home, reduced international demand for United States debt, and greater vulnerability to financial shocks. It means that America will no longer be able to rely on the rest of the world to absorb its excess money, creation, or finance its deficits at artificially low interest rates. Without that advantage, the economic pressures that have already strained American households will intensify. History shows that global reserve currencies shift in cycles. Each rise and fall coincides with the rise and fall of the empires that issued them. The dollar is not immune to this cycle. It is approaching a phase where its dominance is challenged not by a single nation, but by a coalition of economies, technologies, and geopolitical strategies. America is losing the advantage it once believed was permanent, and the global shift away from the dollar is not a distant threat. It is happening now, reshaping the financial landscape one transaction, one alliance, and one decision at a time. When the financial shock finally arrives, it will not come as a single dramatic collapse that announces itself in headlines and breaking news alerts. It will come quietly, gradually, then all at once, in ways that appear subtle at first, but quickly become undeniable. The most dangerous crises are not the ones that strike suddenly. They are the ones that unfold in silence, where each small shift feels manageable until the entire structure can no longer hold together. America is approaching that moment. The first sign will be the disappearance of affordability. Mortgage rates will rise to levels that freeze the housing market. New buyers will be locked out entirely, while existing homeowners will see their monthly payments climb to unbearable levels when adjustable rates reset. Renting will no longer be the safe alternative it once was. Landlords facing higher costs will raise prices, pushing thousands of families into financial distress. Shelters will swell. Evictions will rise. The illusion of housing stability will evaporate in months, not years. The second impact will be on savings and retirement. As inflation accelerates and the dollar weakens, the value of savings will erode faster than most people realize. A retirement fund that once felt secure will suddenly appear fragile, vulnerable, and shrinking. Millions who believed they were prepared for the future will discover that decades of discipline were built on a currency whose strength was never guaranteed. Pension systems will strain. Social security will face pressures that force difficult decisions. Households that planned responsibly will feel betrayed by a system that could not protect them. The third impact will be a collapse of trust. When confidence fails, it does not fail gradually. It cracks in an instant. A bank run does not begin with millions of people panicking at once. It begins with a few withdrawals, followed by hesitation, followed by a sudden, collective realization that the stability everyone assumed was certain is no longer secure. Once trust begins to break, institutions lose their legitimacy. Markets lose their predictability. Leaders lose their authority, and the public loses its sense of stability. The fourth impact will be cultural. Economic shocks do not remain confined to banks and balance sheets. They seep into the psychology of a nation. They change how people behave, how they plan, and how they relate to one another. When financial security evaporates, optimism fades. Communities fracture. Political divides deepen. The old narratives that once united the country begin to erode. In their place emerges a darker, more uncertain worldview, a recognition that the system may not recover as quickly as before, or perhaps at all. The final impact will be geopolitical. When a nation loses the trust of its citizens, it can still function. But when a nation loses the trust of the world, the consequences are far more profound. A weakened dollar means weakened influence. A weakened influence means diminished power. Allies become cautious. Rivals become ambitious. The balance that defined the post-war era will dissolve, replaced by a multipolar world where the United States must compete rather than command. And yet, the most haunting realization is this: the shock does not need to be sudden to be devastating. It merely needs to reach a point where the accumulated weaknesses of the system can no longer be ignored. Inflation, debt, declining productivity, weakening global confidence is a spark. Together, they form a slow-burning fuse that leads toward a structural shift in the economic order. This is the moment America is approaching. A moment when the financial pressures that once felt distant will become intimate. A moment when the comfort of past assumptions will collide with the reality of present fragility. A moment when the nation finally confronts the consequences of decades spent postponing difficult decisions. Nobody is ready for this moment, because modern America has no living memory of a system-wide reset. The last major transition of this scale happened generations ago. In a world that was smaller, less interconnected, and far more resilient to global contagion. Today's world is far different. Every shock transmits instantly. Every weakness magnifies. Every miscalculation grows exponentially. But history is not simply a record of decline. It is also a record of renewal. The nations that survive great shocks are the ones that recognize the moment for what it is: a turning point, a recalibration, a chance to rebuild on a foundation stronger than the one that cracked. Whether the United States will emerge stronger or weaker depends on choices yet to be made, choices that require honesty, discipline, and a long-term vision that has been absent for far too long. The financial shock is coming. Nobody is ready. But readiness is no longer the luxury of the few. It is the obligation of everyone who seeks to understand the world that is forming beneath the one we have taken for granted.